Hello and welcome to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm your host Daniel Watkins, and on today's episode we'll be going back in time a little bit over 200 years to find out about the Percy Tenantry Volunteers, a group of soldiers based at Alnwick Castle who had the job of protecting the northeast of England from invasion by Napoleon Bonaparte and his French armies. I spoke with Bill Openshaw and Nick Lewis, who have each done years of research into the Percy Tenantry Volunteers, and they shared some of their insights and some fascinating details into this intriguing and interesting part of Alnwick Castle's history. I hope you enjoy. I am very happy to be joined today on the Alnwick Castle Podcast by Bill Openshaw and Nick Lewis. How are you both?
Very good, thank you.
Good, thank you.
You're both on this episode of the podcast because you're probably the two people in the world who know the most about today's subject, which is the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. Who wants to tackle the first important subject of what is a Percy Tenantry Volunteer?
Oh, Bill, I think that's your area.
I'm sure everybody's aware of the Home Guard of the Second World War. A similar thing was set up just over 200 years ago when we were facing fears of an invasion from the French. Volunteers were called for all around the country. Almost 500,000 men were raised at the height of the invasion scares. Most of these volunteers were raised through public subscription. They were paid their wages, as it were, by the government. But up in Northumberland, there was a very special corps of volunteers called the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. They were all paid for and clothed by the second Duke of Northumberland. They were in existence from 1798 until 1814. So if the French had ever landed on the northeast coast, the Percy Tenantry, along with about 12 or so other volunteer forces from Northumberland actually, they were all ready to defend house and home from the dreaded French.
We've mentioned the second Duke of Northumberland there. Nick, who was the second Duke of Northumberland and what made him start this force of volunteers?
Well, Hugh Percy, the second Duke of Northumberland, was a fascinating character. He's the main driving force behind the organisation of the Percy Tenantry Volunteers and what it became. Without him, it doesn't exist. He is the sort of father figure in many ways of it. He's the head of the estate, but his life prior to the formation of the tenantry is really interesting. He's a career soldier. He experiences some of the key fights during the early part of the American War of Independence, but famously falls out with one of the commanders over there and ends up coming back to Britain probably before most of the other high command start taking big reputational hits. So Percy actually escapes from America with his reputation intact, but not before his experiences really become very formative in terms of how he sees a smaller, poorer equipped force can actually fight and defeat a larger and much better equipped force, as the American colonists did in the war. And he put some of that, or a lot of that learning into action on the formation of the Tenantry Volunteers first in 1798. And it's his background really that allows this force to become viable and become a really decent fighting force.
Were the Percy Tenantry Volunteers based at Alnwick Castle, or what connection did they have to the castle?
Alnwick was certainly an important part of the Tenantry Volunteers organisation. There were two official depots in the organisation, Alnwick Castle being one and Prudhoe Castle being the other. The Tenantry Volunteers were divided roughly into two districts, a northern and southern district. Alnwick was the capital of the northern district and would administer the companies that mustered in the north of the Duke's holdings in the county. And equally, Prudhoe on the Tyne would do the same for the various companies based down on the Tyne largely, but out as far as the coast and up into the Tyne Valley. So Alnwick was effectively the spiritual home because it's the seat of the Duke of Northumberland anyway. But really, in terms from a military point of view, it was one of two depots.
So we've mentioned Hugh Percy, second Duke of Northumberland. That explains Percy. It sounds like they were volunteers, so that seems self-explanatory. This word in the middle, tenantry, is not one that you frequently come across. Bill, what is meant by tenantry in terms of Percy Tenantry Volunteers?
All of the volunteer forces that were raised during the period were raised by towns, villages, gentlemen. Just the general public would join these volunteer forces. The difference with the Percy Tenantry Volunteers, they were all made up by tenants of the Duke of Northumberland. That is, amongst his ducal estates in Northumberland, he obviously had a lot of tenant farmers and various properties that he leased. So it could not necessarily just farms, it could have been things like glassworks, all sorts of things. People tend to think that his tenants were all made up of farmers, which isn't quite true. Possibly the vast majority were tenant farmers, but there was lots of other businesses as well. It could be your local butcher. His property was leased by the Duke. So, as I say, they're all tenants of the Duke of Northumberland or their families or the servants of tenants. The idea was that only they could join. It perhaps gave the Duke a little bit more control. For instance, all the officers were people that were known by the Duke or that had good references. They were known by his commissioners. So certainly the officers were trusted gentlemen from amongst his tenantry. And anybody who was a little bit perhaps shady wouldn't be allowed into the tenantry. It would keep a bit more control, I think, about who could join and who couldn't.
It was one of the key motivating factors as well, because the tenantry were based on the land, as Bill said, largely in terms of an agricultural workforce. In the South District on the Tyne, of course, you'd have a slightly different makeup of workers, people involved in the coal industry, for example, on the River Tyne and out on at Tynemouth, a slightly different makeup out there. But these people were all tied to the estate because they were, as we've said, they're tenants. They're part of this organisation, this wider community, which in the long run becomes part of why these guys are signing up to this. They feel that they're going to be able to defend themselves and their families and their property from the invader, which is not something that you could necessarily do if you were in the county militia, where you may well be posted, or you usually were posted, to another part of the country. That was a decision usually taken by the government to keep people away from their homes so they wouldn't just desert. And actually, one of the key ways of getting people to join the tenantry as opposed to the militia was that the Second Duke brought in an oath of attestation, a piece of paper that basically said you were in the Percy Tenantry Volunteers and therefore could not be taken away into the militia. And that was very attractive to these guys on the Northumberland estates and was a motivating factor to sign up.
It was a historical thing as well. It wasn't the first time that not necessarily the Dukes, but going back to the Earls of Northumberland, the Percys, going back to the 1500s, 1600s, or even earlier, the Border Eva period, at times the tenants would be raised to follow their feudal landlord, as it were, whether it be whichever earl it was at the period. And so by the time of the Second Duke, there was this continuation of the armed tenantry, if you like, as well. So it wasn't something that was brand new. It was traditional amongst the tenants of the Duke that had gone on for many hundreds of years.
And how high level a threat was this potential invasion? How likely was it that Napoleon Bonaparte and his French armies were going to arrive in the northeast of England? Would the Percy Tenantry have reason to be worried?
Certainly in the first iteration of the Tenantry from 1798 onwards. The Tenantry were disbanded in 1803, the Peace of Amiens, but were very quickly reorganised after that. And even after the Battle of Trafalgar, which traditionally ends the Napoleonic threat because basically it's the French Empire as a naval power decline and become a continental power. But even after that period, there's still several occasions where Bonaparte threatens to acquire himself a navy, such as the Danish navy at Copenhagen in 1807. Before that, though, there's several landings. The most famous one, I suppose, is at Fishguard, I think in 1798. There's attempts by the Republican French before Bonaparte to get into Ireland, one of which is very close to succeeding, but the weather intervenes. And the French are involved in the rebellions in Ireland in the latter part of the 18th century as well. So there's an acceptance, I think, in the British population that there's an invasion planned. We know that Bonaparte's army was stationed at Boulogne in the summer of 1805, just before the Battle of Trafalgar, and he ends up marching them off to Austerlitz, into his eastern front, which I suppose could be seen as a change. But as Bill touched on earlier, the Percy Tenantry Volunteers endure right through until the end of the Napoleonic Wars, properly in 1814, discounting the 100 Days in 1815, culminating at Waterloo. By then it's totally gone, but there is still this threat that something could go wrong on the continent and that Bonaparte could rise or could change his strategy, and that landing in Britain would be an inevitable target of his. So it's a constant threat through the period, I think. I don't know if Bill has a different approach from his recent research.
Yeah, I mean, Nick touched on it there when he said the French invasion at Fishguard, that was actually part of a larger plan that the French had come up with back in 1797 or so. They came up with a plan to have a large-scale invasion of Ireland and two smaller invasion forces attacking the mainland. One would land in the southwest, one would actually land in the northeast. The idea was the force would land in the southwest, move up towards Manchester, Liverpool, the new industrial areas. A force would land on the northeast coast and march towards Manchester, Liverpool. The French generally thought that the peasantry of Britain, if you like, would rise up against their masters and join the revolution. But as Nick says, an invasion force did set out, in fact, but because of the bad weather, they were forced back. However, the small invasion force that was meant for the southwest did actually land in Fishguard. About 1,200 Frenchmen, known as the Black Legion. They didn't have a very good reputation. Most of them had just been let out of prison. As soon as they landed, they started plundering, getting the local beer and wines. But about 2 or 3 days later, they actually ended up surrendering to the local ladies. There was a few militia forces and volunteer forces, but an officer, a British officer, had convinced the French that they were totally outnumbered. They actually weren't, but when the French were down on the beach, a lot of people of the local citizens got together, as well as the remnants of the volunteers and militia forces. And from a distance, the Welsh women in the traditional dress of red jackets and tall black hats, they looked like soldiers. And the French fell for it and they actually surrendered. There was one lady, I can't remember her name offhand, but she captured about 12 Frenchmen by herself. I think she has a statue to her in Fishguard today. So yes, it was a very real threat, and there had been an actual threat to land in Northumberland. So although people think it was the south coast that was vulnerable, the northeast was just as vulnerable.
Am I right in thinking, Bill, that one of the generals involved in that bigger French plan to invade in Ireland and in the south of England was Lazare Hoche, the revolutionary general? And I think I remember in my research, which was a while ago now, but there was a survey carried out or a report sent to General Hoche in Paris that specifically noted how vulnerable the beaches of the north-east coast of England were and how useful and how appropriate they would be for a landing, particularly because of how far away it is from the centres of power, particularly in London. So invading on the south coast might make immediate strategic sense, but the main centres of power in Britain are pretty heavily defended, particularly around Portsmouth and Southampton, the Solent, but also the Thames Estuary and London itself. And actually establishing a base either in the southwest, in Wales, in Ireland, but indeed in the north of England would make an awful lot of sense. And it's almost a little bit like a soft underbelly that Churchill talked of Italy in the Second World War. It's a way of getting your forces not exactly to where you want to be, but somewhere you can land, you can resupply, you can chivvy on the locals if you think that they're going to support you, and get this base, this bridgehead established. And Northumberland really does lend itself to that. It's not only in the Napoleonic Wars, we've touched on the Second World War, but there's plenty of other foreign powers who've had their eye on Northumberland over the years. We could go back as far as the Danes in 793, I suppose, but particularly in this period, this area around northeast England is somewhere that Bonaparte, but particularly his predecessor Lazare Hoche, had his eye on as a potential landing area.
Just going back to the Duke and his thoughts about defending the northeast, it seemed that the government were intent on defending Newcastle, but the Duke actually argued that why defend Newcastle? The northeast was important because of its coal, a lot of it being sent down to London. He thought defending Newcastle was of no great benefit, really. You had to defend the collieries and the coastal areas. The French could easily bypass Newcastle, but if they took the collieries and places like that, it would stop the coal getting to the likes of London. And so he did differ to the government's thoughts on several things, and that was one of them.
So the threat was real, but I'm guessing the Percy Tenantry weren't just grabbing any weapon they could find and running out to fight the French. There must have been training involved. How do you train a volunteer force at this time in history?
As Nick was saying earlier, it was the Duke's own experiences, particularly while over in America, that formed his thinking. He was actually ahead of his time. The main way of fighting 200 years ago was for troops to line up in large lines or blocks of men. They did have what was called light infantry, where men would be spread out, but there were actually very few of those. But during the American War of Independence, the American militiamen and Minutemen weren't fighting fair. They weren't fighting in big blocks of men. They were hiding behind walls and hedges, making use of cover, and made it very difficult for the British to actually shoot at them. The Duke knew if the French ever landed on the northeast coast, he wouldn't be able to stop them in the traditional manner. So he taught his men these light infantry tactics, or guerrilla tactics, if you like, as they became better known as. For instance, he taught his men never to shoot at the enemy unless you're sure you're going to hit your mark. He taught them to conceal themselves. And quite a novelty at the time, he clothed his men not in the traditional red, but he clothed them in green. Now, that's not to say they were absolutely unique. I've discovered there were a few other forces, small volunteer corps, that wore green as well. But certainly the Percy Tenantry were the largest. And at this point, none of the British Army were wearing green. So the benefit of green, of course, it's easier to conceal yourselves wearing the green. But going back to your early question of weapons, the weapons were actually provided by the government. But what happened at the second embodiment in 1803, when they were re-raised again, by this time his tenantry, infantry, had been trained to such a high point. They were very good marksmen, and he wanted to improve them even further and wanted rifles. The British Army had only just started using rifles through a corps called the Experimental Corps of Riflemen, who became the famous 95th Rifles. Anybody who's watched or read the books about Richard Sharp from the period will know about the 95th Regiment. But the Percy Tenantry were given old Prussian rifles, which weren't of good quality, but it meant they were a lot more accurate. And that made them a little bit different to everybody else. There were other smaller forces that did use rifles, but amongst the volunteers, there was certainly the largest force using the rifles, and that's what makes them fairly unique.
We know as well in terms of training that the local community or the local economy got involved as well, and the printer in Alnwick, Mr. Catnach, was running off copies of targets for the guys to practice. He was printing those. That's money coming from the estate into the community, and that's once a week. There's over 1,300 riflemen in the corps, all firing away at these targets that are printed by a local printer. Just one real detailed microcosm of how this was all working. And I think Bill would agree, by the end of their existence, by 1813-14, they were reasonably competent at what they were doing. Of course, they were never tested by French regulars. And it's obviously it's hypothetical to discuss how they might have got on, but I don't think the Duke left any stone unturned. And as Bill quite rightly said, he was ahead of his time. The tactics he was using would have been familiar to special forces in the 20th century. The way that, as Bill said, he didn't want them to give their position away. Of course, they were using rifles with black powder, so the minute you fire your weapon, your position's gone. And the Duke was giving himself or his force the best chance of withstanding any potential invasion.
Yeah, just carrying on from what Nick said there about the target practice, if you like, the government would provide so much ammunition for the volunteers. I think it was about 12 blank shots and about 12 live firing shots, which isn't very much. So the Duke actually brought in his own gunpowder, provided his own lead. Christopher Blackett was a mine owner down on Tyneside, but he also had a lead works He had lead mines in North Yorkshire, I believe. So he was able to get a lot of lead from him, and the Duke had his own gunpowder mills. So the supply of gunpowder and lead for the Percy Tenantry wasn't a great problem. And as Nick said, if you're going to be practicing every week, you need ammunition. And they weren't going to get that from the government. So whilst most of the other volunteers in the country were only having about a dozen live shots to fire every year, it appears that for every muster, the men were practicing with at least 3 to 6 live shots every week. So that would have been quite a bit of live ammunition, certainly far in excess of what the government would provide.
It seems to me like the second Duke was quite a good leader to these men. Would that be right?
Again, going back to his experiences in America, at Lexington, the Duke, he was Earl Percy at the time, he pretty much saved the British Army from a complete disaster. If that expedition force had been caught by the Americans, and it was a very close run thing, then the war might have ended a lot sooner. Fortunately, Earl Percy knew what he was doing, he knew the lay of the land, and he took an unexpected route back to Boston, which took the Americans completely by surprise, but ended up saving the British Army, as I say, from disaster. So this is the sort of guy he was. He was leading from the front. Again, at Lexington, his horse was shot. He had a button shot off his uniform. As an officer, he was mounted on his horse throughout the retreat, where most of his men were dismounted, because anybody on a horse was going to be shot at by the Americans. But Percy stayed on his horse for the full retreat, so he was a prime target. But he wanted to show his men that he wasn't afraid. He needed to keep their morale up. So he was very much a hands-on officer, as it were, very credible. So I think if the French had come, he would have been in the thick of it.
And I think there's a genuine loyalty to the family, to the Percy name and to the banner, which, as Bill touched on, this goes back many, many centuries, even from the early part of the 19th century. You think of all the great names down the years through the Percy family, particularly Hotspur. You know, this is something that the tenantry still see, this sort of feudal relationship, as being something to be proud of. And it's quite difficult, I suppose, in the 21st century to understand that thinking. But it's something that had developed over many, many centuries. And that there was this genuine loyalty to the family, but also from the Duke's point of view, a paternal feeling, a feeling of protecting not only his lands, his holdings, his estates, but his people as well. The Percys, through the Middle Ages, were seen as kings in the north. They were almost their own private entity. And indeed, that does seep through into this period. And it's probably still present in the 20th century, or the early part at least, in how estate workers feel and how people in this area feel. And I mean, it's quite well shown today by the presence of the Percy Tenantry column in Alnwick on Cooper's Hill, which is often misnamed as the Farmer's Folly. And the story goes that the tenantry decided to raise the monument to the Duke, and the Duke sees that they can afford this, so decides to raise the rents. When actually it's something that is less cynical than that. And it's a monument that was put up out of genuine fondness, I think, for the way that the Duke and his family had looked after their holdings and their people right through that period and indeed into the misty past.
How many Percy Tenantry Volunteers were there? How many people are we talking about?
There's about 1,503, to be precise. Certainly, there were more in the second embodiment. When it was first raised in 1798, it consisted of about 1,000 men, infantry and cavalry. In the second embodiment, it was half as large again, say about 1,500 men, riflemen, cavalry, but also an artillery had been added as well. There were 17 companies. Each company consisted of about 70 men each, including the officers, and each troop of cavalry was about 40 men each. So yes, there was just over 1,500. That includes everybody, including the likes of the chaplain. There was a chaplain, surgeons, people like that as well.
And it's worth, again, coming back to the second Duke, he was a military man. He was a general in the British Army. He knew how to run a military organisation. So obviously you've got the guys at the front firing the guns, but all the way back you've got that logistical arm, that operational side that keeps it all ticking over. And as part of that, there's a bureaucracy as well. There's some really fascinating men working just below the Duke's level. Bill's done a lot of work on Sir David Smith, the Duke's land agent, who had spent a lot of time in North America, but had come over and ended up as Colonel Smith, I should say, of the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. And all the way through that structure, you've got records being kept. And that's how we know what we know about the tenantry today, that these records exist and we can go back to them. And you can get muster records for the Leamington Company on Tyneside on a particular day. You can find out who was there, who claimed their pay. You've got records running right through, particularly things like disciplinary action and things like that, where we actually get the names of the private soldiers. So the records are vast, and they're indicative of somebody who knew how to run a military organisation like General Percy did.
You've mentioned that the Percy Tenantry Volunteers continued until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. How did they come to an end? Was it a case of Napoleon was beaten and they all went home? What happened at the very end of their time? Because they're not around today, are they?
The government actually stood the volunteers down in 1813, except for a few units around London, Bristol, Edinburgh, and a very famous corps called the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. They actually remained. Now, you can look at that two ways. You can think, well, why have the government maintained the Percy Tenantry Volunteers? You could say it's because, well, the Duke's paying for them. Or you could say that it's because they're one of the best in the country. Take which answer you like. But a year later, when Napoleon was captured, well, when he abdicated for the first time, then the rest of the volunteers were disbanded. And as Nick said earlier, when Napoleon escaped from Elba, they didn't really have time to re-raise the volunteers. And after Waterloo, of course, there was no need. But the interesting thing is the artillery of the Percy Tenantry continued in some form until about 1860. At this point, there was a little bit of friction with the French again, and new volunteers were raised throughout the country, except these were more under the military wing, as it were. And the artillery volunteers within the castle at Alnwick, they decided they wanted to be part of this, and they asked permission to be called the Percy Volunteer Artillery. So the PTV, in a way, go all the way up to 1901, when that volunteer force was finally disbanded as well. So they were all around for almost 100 years in actuality.
There's another sort of offshoot of the tenantry slightly closer to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where there's a detachment of special constables are raised in 1819. And it's interesting to see how many familiar names appear on the registers or the enrolment registers of the Special Constabulary in Northumberland. These are all veterans of the Tenantry Volunteers. I say veterans in the loosest sense, but these are guys who've served through the Napoleonic Wars. They've done their mustering, and in doing so, a sort of esprit de corps has been created. There's something there that's probably only understood by those who served through it, that's tangible, that they want to hang on to. And you can imagine the sort of flood of people wanting to get that again, and the Special Constabulary seems to have provided that for some of these men, and that they can actually maybe experience that again. And in fact, I think in the Constable's Tower at Alnwick Castle for many years, there was a number of the Special Constabulary's truncheons still on display with the royal crest on it, which always made me wonder whether the constabulary were keen to bash people on the head with the king's name. It seemed to be quite appropriate.
Yeah, Nick's quite right. And obviously a lot of people have heard of Peterloo, the massacre in Manchester that happened in 1819. There was a lot of social unrest. And so they called for the raising of constables throughout Northumberland. It was actually reported in the newspapers that the Percy Tenantry were being raised yet again to put down any insurrection. But the third Duke, who had been Earl Percy, the colonel of the regiment during the Napoleonic Wars, he would have none of it. It was a thing that had gone back to the second Duke. The Duke was always against the volunteers being used as a police force. So when there was the social unrest in the sort of 1820s or so, although as Lord Lieutenant he had to raise constables in case there was any civil unrest, he wouldn't raise his armed body of men again. He wasn't going to use those to put down any insurrection. But as Nick said, yes, those batons that would have been felt if you've had it across the head, they're still to be seen in the museum today.
Just to lead on from what Bill mentioned, I think we've probably glossed over a little bit the role of Earl Percy, the future third Duke of Northumberland, in this. There's a famous painting of him in the dining room at Alnwick in his uniform of an officer of the Tenantry Volunteers. He had a huge role to play in this, as obviously the Duke's son and heir, but he was a really important character in the actual day-to-day running of the corps. He's the guy that's organising everything. He's particularly leaning on his majors and the other colonels in the regiment to organise things. And actually, just you saying that, Bill, reminded me, one of my favourite little bits of trivia about the Percy Tenantry Volunteers is that, although we remember it for the role of the second Duke in particular, that I think I'm right in saying there was 4 Dukes served in the Tenantry Volunteers at one point. The third Duke, of course, as Earl Percy. The fourth Duke, I think, mustered with the Shillbottle Company, and I can't remember the exact year, but I'm sure he was about 11 when he did it, which is a lovely thought, that this 11-year-old member of the nobility coming along and having a go with a rifle. And I think the future 5th Duke as well, as Earl of Beverley, I think, was mustering as well in his youth. It just goes back again to the way that the Percy family sort of run right through this, but particularly the second Duke. But there was 4 of them involved at one stage or another.
Both of you have got a little bit of a connection to the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. You have both worn uniforms not unlike theirs, kind of taken up that tradition in the modern day. How has it felt to kind of relive some of that history that you both know so much about?
Yeah, well, I've been doing the Napoleonic reenactment for over 20 years with the Durham Light Infantry, the 68th Regiment. So when I had the chance to don a Percy Tenantry uniform, of course, I couldn't refuse it. It's quite special to wear it at Alnwick Castle. Of course, all the history there. And you know that in that very place, the men that were wearing their uniforms were practicing and going through all their exercise and things in those very grounds. And it is quite special. And when we have those uniforms on and the public are coming in, they're not quite sure what you're wearing. So it's good to explain the history of who they were, what they did. And a lot of people do find it fascinating.
I would absolutely agree. I think it's a really special feeling. Once you get over the sort of itchiness of the wool on certain bits, I would definitely agree with Bill, particularly in somewhere like the Constable's Tower, which was such an important part of the operation at Alnwick. That was the weapons depot, and how it was previously arranged where the armourer's room was set up. And I remember spending time in there on quiet days when there wasn't necessarily many public around, and you do get that buzz, that sort of shiver down your spine almost, that there was a time when someone standing in there in a green uniform wasn't that unusual and didn't look odd. And you feel that direct connection with the men. I remember as well, particularly the display in the entrance, the lower guard chamber, in the castle keep, where the weapons are all displayed. And having the time at least to look closely at these weapons and get that connection to those men, the weapons having the individual stamps on the trigger guard, particularly the pistols. You can see the company number or company letter and the number, and that can be related back to the muster lists, and so you know which man fired that weapon back in the Napoleonic Wars. And standing there in a green uniform with a shako on and extremely itchy white pants, you really get that link back to those guys that they're doing it for real, and it's a really, really special feeling.
Yeah, just to add a little bit what Nick said about the weapons, when you look very closely at them, there's actually at least one powder flask we found in the front hall that's actually got the guy's name scratched into it. So, it's quite special because there is that connection there. Do you think that 200 years ago there was a guy scratching his name, and now it's there on the wall for all time, as it were? And if we were able to get closely to some of the others, I'm sure we'd find other names scratched into them. For instance, back in the museum again, in the Constable's Tower, one of the bugles, or at least 2 of the bugles, have got the initials scratched in, and we've been able to identify which bugle has actually blew those bugles. So, yeah, it makes a nice bit of the human story.
Nick, you gave us a little bit of favourite Percy Tenantry trivia. Have either of you got any other favourite facts that you really, really like about this group of people?
Well, one of the things we haven't talked about is actually the casualties of war, as it were. Famously, we've heard the only casualty of the Percy Tenantry was actually a pig that was accidentally shot on the links at Almouth, which is quite an amusing story and does appear to be true. However, there are a few more sad fatalities within the Percy Tenantry. There were men that actually died. 2 men actually drowned on the River Aln coming home from muster one night. And again, there's a story that one man had been drinking too much. As he was being ferried across the river, he fell in and drowned. But in actual fact, it was 2 men that drowned, and they weren't drunk. It was a complete accident. I found a newspaper cutting, and it describes how a 3rd man also fell in the water and how he hung onto the side of the boat holding his musket above the water to keep it dry. So even though he was in peril of death, he still tried to keep his musket dry, as it were. But that's one of my favourite stories.
The one I remember was Rifleman Brown, I think, who drowned in the Aln estuary on his way. I think he must have lived in Alnmouth and he'd been mustering at Lesbury. But as far as I can recall from the records, the death wasn't necessarily recorded at the time, or at least I didn't find the record of his death in 1806. But it was when they were disbanding in 1814 that his death came to light, because they realised his rifle was missing. And it transpired that it was at the bottom of the river. And that's how the story came to light. I don't know if you came across that one, Bill, or whether I'm mixing it up. But
yeah, it is actually the same story.
Rifleman Dawson, I beg your pardon, sorry.
Dawson, that's right, Corporal Dawson and William Sawdy were the 2 men, unfortunate men. We actually found that the Duke had actually paid for their funerals as well. If you go to Shilbottle Church today, you'll see the gravestone of Dawson. But it was actually a newspaper clipping I found that explained the whole story of what actually happened. But it is the same incident. Funny enough, a year earlier, 2 cavalrymen had been returning from muster, and one met his death down in Whittle, next to Cullercoats. They'd been going back home next to a quarry, and one of the horse and riders fell into the quarry. And although the horse escaped, the poor old Percy cavalryman actually drowned. There's certainly more than just a pig that died during the time of the Percy Tenantry.
There's one more I can offer you, which I've had to pull up my notes for. But there was one occasion, again, Bill, you probably come across it, when Lieutenant Taylor of the Shilbottle Company got himself into a bit of an argument with a local collier, or owner of the colliery at Doddington, Mr. Burrell. And they ended up, or at least Taylor ended up offering him out for a duel. Which I don't think there's any record as to whether Burrell took him up on it. But I think I remember writing at the time that it came across like that Taylor, once he got his uniform on, became an officer, rather than just still being old John Taylor from Shilbottle. He suddenly decided he could start fighting duels. And it made me wonder whether that was a general feeling across the corps, that these guys who were often provincial doctors or professionals or whatever would suddenly start thinking in terms of, military honour and things like that. So I wonder if there was ever a duel fought at Shilbottle over an argument with a colliery manager.
Quite possibly. So we're actually talking about court-martialling Taylor because of the incident, but we don't actually know whether the duel took place, unfortunately. Again, it's just little scraps of information. We don't get the full story.
There's a lot more research to do, Bill, isn't there?
There's always new material coming to light, yes.
Well, let's hope there was a duel, but that it happened, but it ended peacefully and nobody got shot. The best kind of duel. And that was an excellent trivia duel to end this on, I think. So thank you very much to Bill Openshaw and Nick Lewis for joining us for that fascinating conversation on the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. Plenty more to learn and find out about this period in Alnwick Castle's history, so hopefully we'll be able to have one or both of you back on the podcast in the future. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Thanks very much.
That was Bill Openshaw and Nick Lewis talking about the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. And if you would like to visit Alnwick Castle and find out more about the Percy Tenantry, you can do so in our Constable's Tower exhibition. The top floor of that tower is devoted to the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. Or if you go into the staterooms, you'll see a display of some of their weaponry in the entrance hall. If you'd like to know more about anything we've talked about on today's episode, you can get in touch with us on Twitter at Alnwick Castle or by emailing podcast@alnwickcastle.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review or a 5-star rating if you had a good time. We'd also love it if you recommended this podcast to your friends. But for now, I've been Daniel. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.